Serious. What is the fastest way you have seen someone ruin their life? I wouldn't call them friends by any means, but an acquaintance and his girlfriend did a dine and dash, and their server followed them outside and stood in front of their car to prevent them from leaving until the police arrived. Stupid move on the server's part for sure, but all the same, this acquaintance ran the server over and hit like 2 or 3 parked cars, in the process getting out of the parking lot. So, yeah, they totaled their car, multiple other cars, and they both caught multiple felony charges. Both of them had priors too. Ended up pleading, and as far as I can recall, they both got roughly 5+ year sentences over a $1.40 meal. Maybe not 100% life-ruining, but I'd say over $40 it's proportionally pretty fucking stupid. A close friend of my best friend grabbed his 8-year-old son's new skateboard and took off down a hill in Georgia. Hit a rock, landed on his head, and had permanent brain damage. He lived years before he mercifully died. Had to be restrained the whole time because the damage made him erratic and violent. Wear a helmet. Saw a pilot without instrument rating take off into IMC conditions. Instrument meteorological conditions is a flight category that describes weather conditions that require pilots to fly primarily by instruments, rather than use visual cues to maintain controlled flight. He had his whole family on board. Weather was closing in. He agreed that it was impossible to get home, but wanted to make it to a larger municipal airport so they wouldn't have to stay in a motel. The fuel attendant and a bunch of old veteran pilots hanging around the airport office all said they'd drive him to a nicer place, but he thought he'd have a better chance of getting out the next day from the other airport. Conditions weren't that bad when he took off, but we all agreed later that no one without instrument rating should have flown that day. So the last time anyone saw that whole family, pilot, wife, 2 adult sons alive, was all of us watching him take off and fly just under the cloud base to do a scud run in the direction of the nearest Mooney. They crashed in full overcast 10 miles out, no survivors. All told, it probably took 15 minutes for this guy to make the worst and last decision of his life. This was over 30 years ago, but it's haunted me ever since. What should I have done differently that might have convinced him to not fly? I was a newbie pilot at the time, but even I knew it was a bad idea. There were at least 3 other pilots there that day. Did he feel ganged up on? Could we have appointed the most grizzled, straight-shooting, gravel-voiced veteran to take the guy aside and give him a "I'm not your dad, but talk"? Should we have tackled him and taken away his keys? Called the cops? What would we even have told them? I've long since come to terms with it, but there are still the occasional moments where I feel like I failed. Bar fight. Heard a loud commotion for about 30 seconds. Some guy thought this guy was hitting on his date. Suckered punched him. The other guy fell down and clipped the bar. The bar had brass footrest at the base, snapped the guy's neck so loud you could hear it across the room. I posted this once before. I had a friend that had a promising career got upset and went into full road rage for a woman who forgot to turn her blinker on, and he slightly bumped her back bumper on the freeway, causing her to lose control and flipping over and killing the driver and her 2 daughters. Oddly, it was all caught on his car dash cam and a trucker with his own dash cam that was behind him. He is now doing 40+ years in prison. A senior girl from my college pushed another girl she was friends with off an around 30-foot bridge into water as a joke, broke her neck and collarbone, and she's permanently in a wheelchair. I watched this clip on Reddit where these 2 kids were posing with a gun. The girl in the video accidentally shot the boy in the head. She panicked and shot herself. That shit changed me. It all happened so fast. I don't think the clip was longer than 30 seconds. In Germany, there was a contestant on the show Wetten Das, translated as Bet That, a few years ago. In the show, statements about crazy talents and activities were presented by the participants. The contestants bet on things they could do and get a prize if they could actually perform the self-proclaimed tasks/talents. One participant bet that he would be able to jump over moving cars. It went wrong, and he was left a paraplegic. He has since largely recovered, psychological not physical, and is handling it great as far as the public is concerned, but the situation will probably always stick in my mind. A guy from the general area I lived in. Him, 18 at the time, and girl broke up, ended up kidnapping her 3 weeks later and shooting her twice in the head with a handgun he took of his parents' gun safe. Tried driving 5 hours away to his grandparents' ranch to hide the body. ditched his phone driving down the highway. SWAT team was waiting for him when he showed up at Seared Ranch. Made news headlines in CO. I'm a lawyer. Another well-respected lawyer in my jurisdiction was involved in an absolutely huge property settlement involving dozens upon dozens of deeds, side agreements, financial documents, yada yada yada. The whole lot, presumably involving literally 100 or so signatures, had been signed off by her client. In the early hours of the morning, having no doubt slaved away for untold hours getting everything ready for the settlement the next day, she must have realized that she had missed getting one signature on one minor document from her client, so she faked it. I can see the pressure she was under, and how she probably thought, it doesn't matter. My client would have signed it anyway, and only didn't because they overlooked it. No one will ever notice. Someone noticed, and she went from high-paid property lawyer to never being able to practice again, just like that. People occasionally ask me to sign things off, as a lawyer, and suggest I overlook minor irregularities, such as wanting me to witness a signature even though I didn't actually see the signatory sign. Then they get all offended and act like I'm being a stick-up-the-ass perfectionist when I won't do it. What's your scariest stalking experience? I was a shift leader at a Taco Bell. I was always on the floor with my crew, so I was at the front registers or the drive-through register quite often. I was 24, married, with 2 small children, and I only lived a few streets away from my store. I would often walk to work to save gas. A guy a little older than me started coming in a lot. He was always very friendly, almost too friendly. He'd only come in on my shifts, I started to find out. And then it turned out he was there for every single one of my shifts. I told my husband, so I don't think he ever came to our house. But he was a shadow at work. Then one day, I came in and found him being trained by one of the assistant managers. He tried to get put on my shifts, but I freaked out and immediately went to the office to talk to the store manager. She had no idea about how he'd been in the store all the time. She knew there was a guy, but she didn't know it was him. She was horrified. She promised that she'd keep him away from me until she could get him transferred to another store. She called the store closest while I was standing there and got the transfer. He'd be at our store for that day only. His next day would be at the other store, and it would be his home store. She let me take the day off. She called in the other night shift manager. When I came to work the next day, she said that he'd not taken the news well, that he'd have to work at the other store and quit. He came a few more times after that, so I got my husband to sit in the dining room to scare him off. I did not see him again after that. Broke up with a person, and a few days later, my roommate gave me a note that was on my windshield. The note said, "I would have cleaned your car if you didn't cut me off." The next day, the person I broke up with was at my door, repeatedly ringing my camera doorbell. The person then went to my apartment complex office and told the clerks that they hadn't seen me in weeks, and asked if they could be let into my apartment to check on me. The clerks at the office called me and told me everything. They also said that the person waited outside of the apartment complex for a while. I literally had someone at the club break into my house and was sitting on my couch, naked, when I got home from work. When I was in high school, the mother of a friend of mine became kind of obsessed with me. One time, when I was 16, she told me she needed to talk to me in private, and I assumed it was about my friend, so I met with her, and it turned out that she was looking for a romantic encounter. She told me that her marriage was unhappy and that she wanted to be with me. I was a dumb kid and had no idea how to handle it, because I didn't want to wreck my friend's family by saying anything. It got to the point where she would drive around my neighborhood in her minivan, looking for me, because she knew I liked to take walks at night. It eventually ended up in a screaming fight between me and her in a huge rainstorm because she wouldn't leave me alone. That was what finally convinced me I needed help, so I told my parents about it, and it stopped. She eventually ended up divorcing her husband and moving across the country. I never saw her again. Was stalked by a work colleague. I told my boss and other people at work, and no one gave a shit, and the stalking got worse. He would stand at traffic lights watching how I get home every day. One day at a set of red lights, he was acting more shifty than usual, so I watched him from the corner of my eye. I saw a long screwdriver slip from his sleeve, and he rushed at me. I jumped the lights and speeded home. I turned up to work later in the day during the late shift and handed in my keys notice and never went back again. I had a stalker when I was a teenager, but I never found out who it was. For a long time, I would just notice little weird stuff. Someone in the backyard at night tapping on my window. But I wrote a lot of it off as possible pranks or whatever, until one night I was up late on the computer. It was like 2 a.m. My parents were asleep in bed and the doorbell rang. I went to my parents' room and woke them up. They said they didn't hear it and the dog wasn't barking, so they told me to go to bed, so I did, but next morning my dad found a pile of cigarette butts outside the window where I had been on the computer. I used to work in a bar as a karaoke DJ, and I had this gal who was borderline obsessed with me, aka she regularly offered to give me support from behind the booth. One Saturday night after work, like 3 a.m., I came home to her sitting on my couch, naked as the day she was born, and holding a knife. Mind you, I never told her where I lived. She immediately starts yelling that if I won't be with her, she'll use the knife on one or the other of us, and it doesn't seem to matter to her which one. Luckily, I had a nosy neighbor, thank you, Catherine, and thin walls, the only time I've ever been glad of that. The police showed up shortly thereafter and placed her in custody until Monday morning, when I could petition for a stalking order. First thing Monday morning, police report in hand, I got my stalking order. I ended up moving, just out of general caution, and she was never allowed in the bar while I was working again. My senior year of high school, I had this sophomore following me home and putting stuff in my locker. Found a dead bird in my mailbox the day after prom. I was once accused of stalking by a college classmate. I was horrified. A professor I had great respect for and was making a great impression on pulled me to the side on the matter, told me that I was being accused of impropriety, and I attempted to refute or explain and was given the "just save it." In his shoes, I would have felt the same. Doesn't matter what the accused stalker says, and wouldn't believe them anyway. I was told I would be immediately removed from the class for the semester, and that I would need to speak to the dean handling the matter as to whether I would be completely expelled or not. I was an honor roll student, on the dean's list, and on financial aid. I couldn't believe this, and I couldn't withstand this without losing my fin aid. Maybe it's what a stalker deserves. When I went to the dean, he began explaining how my expulsion will go. He didn't want to hear anything. I had to speak over him, interrupting with a rude desperation, in order to make a plea. I showed him how this girl I was stalking gave me her telephone number. I presented her texts where she suggested interacting outside of campus. I had him look over the messages of her offering her home address, along with suggesting I pick her up. I luckily had all the communication of her agreeing to go see a live show together, and where we might eat, or how we will smoke on the way. The transcript further illustrated how she was going to do all this until I arrived at her address. When I got there, she had a sprained ankle and couldn't go out. I was like, no worries, I'm not miffed or anything, I'll go by myself. It was a requirement for another class. It was my birthday, so I made the best of my outing alone. All texts still indicated no problem at all. No issue until the next class, where she told the professor I was stalking her. I wasn't expelled, but I couldn't return to that class. The entire class still had this impression I was creepy or dangerous. I still had to pay for the class and take a W on the transcript. It nearly ruined my life and definitely damaged it. What's the scariest thing you've heard at 2 a.m.? One night I slept in the living room. It was completely dark and just me awake, everyone else in their rooms. I heard a creak as if someone sat in the far corner where the coffee table was. This corner was the far side of the living room where no one can access unless they walked over me. Also, I had the bright idea to see if it's a paranormal thing. I thought to myself, clap if you're here, and heard the most crisp one clap noise in the same corner of the room, bruh. I ran so fast to turn lights on. Don't think I've ever slept in the dark since. Woke up from my bed going side to side, creaking, the door banging on the wall repeatedly. My parents coming into my room yelling, telling me to get out of the house. There was an earthquake going on, a very, very big one. Not me, but my friend that stayed at my house years ago claimed she heard someone run up the outdoor stairs, knock on the door, then run down and run up the indoor stairs and knock on the door. Several times. It would be impossible to run up both sets of stairs in such a short time frame, but she claimed it happened and refused to sleep at my house again. A chunk of ice falling into the blower fan of my window air conditioner, which was right by my head. It sounded like a gunshot went off by my ear, and I also got sprayed by a fine mist. I thought for certain that someone had broke in, shot my wife, and I was being sprayed with her blood. I lived in a country-ish area years ago, was on my front porch with headphones on, listening to music and smoking a blunt. All of a sudden, I hear a faint noise over my music that sounds like a crying child. I pull the headphones off, and it's gone. Put my headphones back on, and a few minutes later, it happens again. Same thing, pull headphones off, and it's gone. Except this time, I keep the headphones off. A few minutes later, I hear what I can only describe as a mix of a child crying and the witch from Left 4 Dead coming from a cow pasture with no houses near it. I nope the fuck out, go back inside and lock the house down like it's fucking Fort Knox. Asked my parents later, and my dad pulls up a YouTube video of fox noises, and sure enough, it was spot on. Oh boy, do I have a story. My sister and I slept in the same room when we lived in our grandparents' house. We both always fought over the top bunk bed that was pushed up against the wall, not too far from the bedroom door. But looking back, it did seem like a massive room. Well, the door was shut tight that night, while the toys scattered all over the floor due to how lazy my sister and I were as kids, always being yelled at to clean up our room. We had one window that we kept covered because I loved the dark, and I still sleep in the dark to this day. And because we snuck out the window twice in our young lives, that the window ended up getting bolted shut. Well, my sister had a nightlight after this event. It had to be around 2, close to 3 in the morning. I had the bottom bunk while my sister had the top. She won the battle between who got the top bunk, and our family settled it with one to get the top one week, while the other had got it the other week. All 4 of them were annoyed by our constant fighting over the top bunk. I was in somewhat of a deep sleep while she whispered my name over and over, me being a light sleeper. I woke up grouchy, asking what she wanted. The tone in her voice made me pull my covers over my head as she asked me, "Do you see that in the corner?" I said no. And she begins freaking out as she describes to me that a tall, dark figure wearing a hat stood in the corner. Now she's creeping me the fuck out. I ask her what it's doing, and with that, I regretted asking. "It's just making noises and standing there." Now I pulled my covers over my head fully as she began freaking out even more. It began walking towards her, and with that, she lost it, yelling for our father as she screamed and cried out. The bedroom door opened as the light to the living room showed nothing but toys and the bunk bed. I took a peek to see what was going on, only to see my sister climbing down the bunk bed really quickly and out the door, ignoring the fact that she ran all over Legos and dolls that her and I left on the floor, her crying out in the living room while my father shut the door, leaving me all alone in the dark. My father left me, all alone, in the dark with a figure in the corner that I couldn't see. Years ago, my wife and I were in bed sleeping. Her children were staying for half the summer with us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to our bedroom door opening. I looked up, and no, I saw my wife's 8-year-old son standing next to her side of the bed. I figured he'd wake her and she could take care of whatever he needed. A few minutes passed and I was about asleep again when I thought I had heard him say anything or my wife move. I sat up in the dark and no one was there. The door was shut and it was very dark in our room. Not thinking much of it, I slid down, got comfortable and tried to fall back to sleep. I had my legs uncovered and my feet hanging off the foot of the bed. I felt 3 taps on the bottom of my foot and sat up quickly. No one there, Al. Still very dark in the room. I lay back down, and just as I'm almost asleep, I feel something grab my left ankle and yank me about a foot toward the foot of the bed. I jumped up and woke my wife up. I weighed 230 pounds. I still can't explain it. What's the most horrifying real-life death you've heard about? I was coming home from baseball practice in high school, and when coming down my street, I see my neighbor across the street outside in the driveway crying. She was 6, and it was pouring. I asked her what was wrong, and all she said was, "Amy is in the closet." I said, "What?" Her parents weren't home, nor were mine. I didn't want to have her explain it, so I asked her to show me. We go in her room, and she is hanging in the closet with a noose around her neck, blood everywhere from slitting her throat and wrist. I went to feel her pulse to make sure she didn't have one. I was 16, I had no idea what to do. We sat outside on the porch until the police came. I couldn't get a hold of their parents as I didn't have their phone numbers and the youngest daughter didn't know. The mom and dad came home and it was just awful. The scream the mom made will always haunt me, and obviously that whole scene will haunt me. It isn't as horrific as these stories are, but to me, this was just as bad. There was an old guy who lived down the road from me. He wasn't good on his feet, so only used the bottom half of his house. He went to go to bed one night, but fell in front of his old electric heater next to his bed in the living room and couldn't get up again. The poor bloke was cooked alive. When the paramedics turned up, they had to go into the garden to vomit. It was horrific, apparently. I only know this because a couple of family members went to see what was happening when an ambulance turned up at his house. I'm not sure who called it. They said it was truly awful. The guy survived for a while in the hospital with his injuries, but unfortunately passed. He must have been in front of the heater for hours, the poor bastard. Guy I knew of flew himself and his family to Florida from the Midwest for a Christmas Disney trip in his personal plane. He was flying in some lower-seated clouds when his engine died. He tried a couple things to restart his engine, but couldn't get it to come back. When he came out of the clouds, he was over a forest with no way to glide somewhere to land, and had to put it down in the trees and hope. The crash killed himself, his wife, and 2 of his 3 kids, except for his youngest daughter, who walked 2 miles barefoot in the late December snow to find help. But she survived. The horrific part of it to me, though, is that this guy's plane has 2 separate fuel tanks, one in the left wing and one in the right wing. The reason the engine died was because it was fuel-starved. The pilot had been flying on a single tank for the entire flight up until that point, but had another wing filled to the brim with fuel. He could have saved his family's lives as well as his own, and prevented his daughter's trauma if he would have just made sure to follow the checklists that pilots of that airframe practice religiously every day that they go fly. People being walled up inside of a brick column or wall. The punishment is called immurement. Last one I heard of was a serial killer in the 1800s. They walled him inside the corner of a building. People said they could hear him screaming for mercy for a week before he fell silent. Imagine, inside a cold, damp, pitch-black chamber too cramped to stand up or sit down. Most likely was crawling with bugs. No food, no water, no mercy. I imagine he went mad before the second day was up because he knew death was the only escape. The woman in China who got stuck in an elevator on a holiday weekend. When they eventually found her, there were scratch marks on the door and her hands were bloody from trying to get out. Jose Malena was cleaning an industrial oven at work. A coworker didn't check if anyone was inside, filled it with tuna, and turned it on. I just can't imagine how awful it would be knowing what was about to happen to you. Hisashi Uchi, a guy who was put through 20,000 times the fatal dose of radiation, 83 days of living hell. That dude involved in a nuclear accident who got exposed to a lot of radiation and lived fully conscious for a few months. Literally 83 days with all of his skin melted off, his DNA completely obliterated, his immune system destroyed. He was undoubtedly in excruciating pain throughout all of this. He begged for death, but they kept pumping him full of healthy blood, transplanting new skin and keeping him alive to whatever extent they could. Kid I went to high school with went out in the forest just to wander on his own. Being a kid at heart, he decided to climb some trees just for fun. Either a branch broke or he just slipped and fell far enough to break his back. That didn't kill him, though. It was winter and started to snow. He laid there, unable to move as he got slowly buried in snow. By the time they found him, he had frozen to death. That shit still eats at my brain sometimes. He was such a nice guy. Serious. What is the scariest, most dreadful, horrifying, stomach-churning thing that has ever happened to you? A man came to my secluded home when my parents were at work. He told me that my mother had left a check for him for charity, and if I let him in, he could find it quickly and leave. I was 11 years old and incredibly naive, and I almost let him in. The only thing between us was a thin screen door with a weak lock, which he began to pull at and test. My usually sweet, nervous lab began to growl at him, and 2 friends I'd brought home with me against explicit instructions came into the room to join me. I guess 3 kids and a furious dog were too much risk, because he muttered something and left. I try not to think about his plans for me, or about the other man that was waiting in his truck the whole time. when my car skidded off an icy road and rolled onto its roof. I was 8 months pregnant, and my 2-year-old was in his car seat in the back. We ended up hanging upside down. If not for my seatbelt and that car seat, it would have been bad news. I had migraines for about 6 months, which were getting progressively worse. MRI came back negative for brain tumors. Doctor tried several medicines before putting me on Imitrex. He said if I felt a migraine coming on, take one and lay down. So one day I got home from work and my head began to spin, so I took one. The headache never subsided. I first noticed my heart began beating erratically, out of control. I almost grabbed my chest, but was completely paralyzed. I could not move my body in any way, shape, or form to dial a phone or alert anyone. I lived alone at the time. The muscles on the sides of my neck and my legs began to pulsate very fast and hard, spasming over and over again, but again I could not move. For a full minute, my lungs stopped working and I couldn't draw breath. Finally, I could draw breath, the spasms stopped, I could move. Called my doctor immediately wondering if I needed to go to the ER, and he said to never take one again and would mark me as allergic. I laid there until everything was working fine again. Took a ride on red without checking when I was a dumb teenager. There was a UPS truck coming at 50 mph that luckily had just enough time to swerve around me into the oncoming traffic lane. Likely would have been dead or life-altering injuries if that driver hadn't been paying attention. Based on number of nightmares since, falling through the ice on a river one night. Knew the ice wasn't likely thick enough yet, but I tried to scoot across anyway. Even took my coat off to save weight. Broke through, and the current pulled me downstream from the hole, so I was on the wrong side of the ice. Luckily, not a big river or too deep, so I went for the bank and stood up to break back through. I wasn't actually scared during it. Mostly I was in overdrive until I was out. Then it all hit me. Camping with my wife, kiddos, and puppa. Middle of summer, middle of the night. Quiet, not even the slightest breeze blowing. Awakened from a dead sleep to the sounds of trees crashing down right beside the tent, all around us. I was sure that we were all about to get smushed. Apparently, one huge one just fell over and brought a few other big ones down with it. I've never been as terrified as I was for those few moments. In the morning, it looked like a war zone at our campsite. One big honkin' tree was about 10 from the tent. I still can't believe we all walked away without a scratch.